The Weeping Willow Funeral Parlor, based on documented patterns of funeral home murders, body trafficking, and family criminal enterprises in early 19th century America, Bedford County, Pennsylvania, November 1823. When Pennsylvania state marshals finally obtained a warrant to search the Garrett family's funeral establishment on the outskirts of Bedford, they expected to find evidence of fraud, missing bodies, forged death certificates, the kind of petty deception that unscrupulous undertakers sometimes practice to increase profits. What they discovered instead was something that made hardened lawmen refuse to enter the building's basement without first fortifying themselves with whiskey and prayer. 37 bodies in various states of preservation, but not the bodies that should have been there. The Garrett Funeral Home's records showed 22 burials pending, 22 families who had paid for their loved ones to be prepared and interred with dignity. Those 22 bodies were gone, sold to medical schools in Philadelphia and Baltimore for anatomical dissection. In their place were 37 others, bodies with no names, no records, no families searching for them, bodies that showed signs of death by violence rather than natural causes, bodies that the Garretts had been collecting, preparing, and disposing of for purposes the marshals were only beginning to understand. But it was what they found in the preparation room that transformed a case of grave robbery into something far darker. Surgical tools still bearing dried blood, restraints bolted to the embalming table, and a journal written in multiple hands documenting what the Garrett family called their special arrangements. A record of murder stretching back 9 years, meticulously kept, describing victims, methods, and disposal with the clinical detachment of people recording business transactions rather than human slaughter. The journal's first entry was dated March 1814. The final entry was dated October 1823, written just weeks before the raid, and it was signed by all 4 members of the Garrett family: Silas Garrett, the patriarch and funeral director, his wife Constance, their son Thomas, their daughter Margaret, an entire family that had turned the business of death into the practice of murder, operating beneath the respectable facade of funeral service for nearly a decade. Before we continue with the story of the Garrett family and the funeral home that became a killing ground, we need you to join this investigation. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell, because stories like this, where evil wore the mask of service and operated in the shadows of grief, deserve to be told. Leave a comment telling us what you think. We want to know if you believe an entire family could participate in systematic murder without anyone discovering the truth for 9 years. What happened at the Garrett Funeral Home didn't begin with murder. It began with desperation and a business opportunity that seemed merely unethical rather than evil. Bedford, Pennsylvania in 1814 was a growing town of approximately 2,000 residents, positioned along the Forbes Road that connected Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. The town served as a waypoint for travelers moving west, a commercial center for the surrounding agricultural region, and increasingly a place where people came to die. Not because Bedford was particularly deadly, but because it was becoming civilized enough to require formal institutions for dealing with death. Silas Garrett arrived in Bedford in 1812 with his family and enough money to purchase a large house on the edge of town. He was 47 years old, a tall, thin man with undertaker's hands, long-fingered and precise. He claimed to have trained in Philadelphia under one of the city's premier funeral directors, though no records of this apprenticeship have ever been found. He claimed his wife Constance came from a respectable Boston family, though her accent suggested origins considerably less refined. Their children, Thomas, age 22, and Margaret, age 19, had the educated manner of people who'd received proper schooling, though again, no records document where this education occurred. The Garretts were, in short, people with carefully constructed backgrounds that didn't quite withstand scrutiny. But in 1812, Bedford, with the War of 1812 consuming attention and resources, no one scrutinized too carefully. The town needed a proper funeral director. The Garretts needed a fresh start. It seemed a mutually beneficial arrangement. Silas established the Weeping Willow Funeral Parlor in the front rooms of their house. He advertised services in the Bedford Gazette. Dignified interment, expert preparation of the deceased, finest caskets and mourning goods, reasonable rates for Christian families. The business grew steadily, Deaths from disease, accidents, and the general hazards of 19th century life provided a steady stream of clients. The Garretts developed a reputation for professionalism and discretion. Families appreciated that Silas handled everything, making death's practical arrangements as painless as possible for the grieving. What those families didn't know was that Silas Garrett was selling their loved ones' bodies. The practice began small and seemed, within the moral framework Silas constructed for himself, justifiable. Medical schools desperately needed cadavers for anatomical instruction. Legal sources, primarily executed criminals, were insufficient for the growing number of medical students. This created a black market for bodies, where unscrupulous people could make substantial profits supplying anatomical schools with questionable merchandise. Silas made contact with a medical school in Philadelphia through an intermediary who specialized in this trade. The arrangement was simple. Silas would prepare bodies for burial as usual, then substitute cheap caskets weighted with stones or clay. The actual bodies would be preserved and shipped to Philadelphia, where they'd be sold to the medical school for $20 to $50 each, depending on condition and freshness. No one opened caskets before burial. No one checked. The fraud was nearly perfect. For 2 years, from 1812 to 1814, this was the extent of the Garretts' criminality. It was body trafficking, not murder. Disturbing, certainly. A violation of trust and human dignity, but not homicide. The shift to murder began in March 1814 with a traveler named William Hodge. Hodge was a merchant traveling from Baltimore to Pittsburgh when his horse went lame just outside Bedford. He stopped at the Garrett house to ask about local stables, not realizing it was primarily a funeral establishment. Silas invited him in, offered him refreshment, and during their conversation learned several crucial facts. Hodge was traveling alone. He was carrying approximately $400 in cash from recent sales. No one in Bedford knew him, and he planned to continue west the next day, meaning his failure to arrive in Pittsburgh wouldn't trigger inquiries for at least a week. What happened next was documented in the journal discovered 9 years later. Silas had called a family meeting that evening. He presented the opportunity with the cold calculation of a business proposal. Hodge had money they needed. Hodge had a body the medical school would pay for. Hodge was a stranger whose disappearance would cause minimal investigation. The logic within the twisted framework Silas was constructing seemed almost reasonable. Constance objected initially, according to the journal. Not on moral grounds, but on practical ones. How would they kill him without arousing suspicion? How would they explain if someone saw him enter their house? What if he fought back? It was Thomas who solved the practical problems. They would invite Hodge to stay the night, offering the hospitality that travelers expected in small towns. They would give him wine laced with laudanum to make him sleep deeply. Once unconscious, Thomas would smother him with a pillow. Quiet, relatively quick, leaving no obvious wounds that might raise questions during medical dissection. They would then prepare the body exactly as they prepared the bodies they were already selling, ship it to Philadelphia, and use Hodge's money to expand their legitimate business. Margaret, the youngest family member, said nothing during this discussion, but she didn't object. And when the family voted, as they apparently did for all major decisions, she raised her hand in favor. William Hodge was murdered that night in a second-floor bedroom of the Garrett house. His body was shipped to Philadelphia within 3 days. His money was divided among the family members, and the Garretts discovered something that would define the next 9 years of their lives. Murder was profitable. Murder was relatively easy. And murder, when conducted carefully within the structure of a funeral business, was nearly impossible to detect. Over the following months, the Garretts refined their methodology. They targeted specific types of victims, travelers passing through Bedford who had no connections to the area, drifters and laborers who had few people who would notice their disappearance. Occasionally, very carefully, local people who were dying anyway and whose deaths could be hastened without arousing suspicion. The methods evolved. Smothering remained a favorite, leaving no marks. Poison was used when victims could be made to appear naturally ill first. Thomas developed a particular technique involving pressure to the carotid arteries that caused unconsciousness and then death within minutes, again leaving minimal physical evidence. The family operated with disturbing efficiency. Silas managed the overall operation, selecting victims and handling the financial arrangements with the medical schools. Constance prepared laudanum-laced food and drinks, her domestic skills repurposed for murder. Thomas handled the physical killing, his young strength making him the family's primary executioner. And Margaret, quiet Margaret, kept the records. The journal was her work, each entry written in her neat handwriting, documenting their crimes with methodical precision. They killed 23 people between March 1814 and December 1816. 23 people whose bodies were sold to medical schools for dissection. 23 people whose deaths went unnoticed or were attributed to the normal hazards of 19th century life. 23 murders that generated approximately $900 in profit, a substantial sum that the Garretts used to expand their legitimate business and purchase additional property. But in late 1816, the medical schools began to have problems. Too many bodies were arriving with suspicious characteristics. Too many showed signs of violence that natural death or execution couldn't explain. Questions were being asked. Investigations were threatened. The Philadelphia school that had been the Garretts' primary customer informed Silas that they could no longer accept his merchandise. The Garretts faced a crisis. They'd grown dependent on the murder income. The legitimate funeral business covered expenses but didn't generate the profits they'd become accustomed to. More dangerously, they'd discovered that stopping was difficult. The family had developed a taste for the power that murder provided. The thrill of selecting victims, the satisfaction of executing perfect crimes, the sense that they were superior beings operating above normal moral constraints. Silas solved the problem by diversifying. If they couldn't sell the bodies, they would still profit from murder in other ways. They would rob victims more thoroughly, taking not just money, but valuables, clothes, anything of worth. They would choose victims more carefully, focusing on people whose possessions would bring substantial returns, and they would dispose of the bodies themselves rather than selling them. This required modifications to the funeral home. Thomas and Silas spent 3 months in early 1817 constructing what they called the Special Preparation Room in the basement. The room featured a large brick furnace, ostensibly for heating water for body preparation, but actually designed to cremate remains. They installed a drain system that could dispose of fluids. They soundproofed the walls with extra layers of brick and insulation. They created essentially a private crematorium where bodies could be destroyed without leaving evidence. The murders resumed in April 1817 with new methods and new purposes. The victims were selected for wealth rather than just availability. A traveling salesman carrying samples of silver goods, a widow traveling to Pittsburgh with her late husband's inheritance, a young couple eloping with their family's valuables. Each murder was carefully planned, each victim was killed, robbed, and cremated. Each crime was documented in Margaret's journal with chilling precision. But the Garretts made a critical error. They became ambitious. In September 1819, they murdered a man named Charles Whitmore, a merchant from Philadelphia who was traveling to Bedford to investigate establishing a branch office. Whitmore was wealthy, important, and unlike most of the Garretts' previous victims, connected to people who would investigate his disappearance thoroughly. When Whitmore failed to arrive in Bedford as scheduled, his business partners contacted Pennsylvania authorities. A marshal named Daniel Harrison was assigned to investigate. Harrison was competent, persistent, and unlike many lawmen of the era, willing to consider that crimes might have been committed against someone respectable. Harrison traced Whitmore's route and determined he'd last been seen near Bedford. He interviewed residents and discovered that several travelers had been reported missing in the area over the past 5 years. Not a large number, and the disappearances had seemed unconnected at the time, but when viewed together, a pattern emerged. Too many people were vanishing in the Bedford area. Too many of them were last seen entering the town on the Forbes Road. Too many were travelers with money. Harrison began investigating local businesses that catered to travelers. The Garrett Funeral Home attracted his attention for several reasons. The Garretts had arrived in Bedford shortly before the disappearances began. They had no verifiable history before 1812. They'd become wealthy quickly, purchasing multiple properties on income that seemed insufficient based on funeral business alone. And several witnesses recalled seeing travelers enter the Garrett house and never emerge. But Harrison couldn't prove anything. He had suspicions, not evidence. The Garretts were careful, leaving no obvious traces, and confronting a respectable family business based on vague suspicions would be professionally risky. Harrison needed something concrete. He found it through Margaret Garrett. Margaret was 27 years old in 1819, unmarried, living in her parents' house and participating in murder as casually as other women her age participated in church socials. But Margaret was beginning to crack under the psychological weight of what her family was doing. She'd started drinking heavily. She'd become withdrawn, avoiding social situations where she'd once been active, and she'd begun making comments that worried her family. Harrison identified Margaret as the weak link. He arranged to encounter her, accidentally, at Bedford's General Store in November 1819. He struck up a conversation, presenting himself as a concerned citizen rather than an investigator. Over several weeks, he engineered additional encounters, building what appeared to be a friendship. Margaret, isolated and increasingly desperate for someone to talk to, began to trust him. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the Garrett family's secrets begin to unravel. If this story is affecting you, share this video with someone who appreciates dark history. Hit that like button to support our content and subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together how this family of killers was finally exposed, because what Marshall Harrison was about to uncover would shock even those who thought they'd seen every form of human evil. Margaret never explicitly confessed to Harrison during their conversations in late 1819 and early 1820, but she dropped hints. She made cryptic comments about her family's business. She suggested that death was more complicated than most people understood. She implied that bodies weren't always what they seemed. Harrison, skilled at reading between lines, understood what she wasn't quite saying. But hints weren't evidence. Harrison needed Margaret to provide something concrete, or he needed another approach entirely. He chose the latter. If he couldn't prove the Garretts were murderers, perhaps he could investigate them for the crime he already suspected them of: body trafficking. Harrison contacted medical schools in Philadelphia and Baltimore, presenting himself as a concerned marshal investigating missing persons. He asked carefully worded questions about their sources for anatomical subjects. Most schools refused to answer, but one administrator, troubled by his own institution's practices, quietly confirmed that they'd purchased bodies from a funeral director in Bedford several years earlier. The arrangement had ended in 1816 after questions arose about the merchandise quality. It wasn't proof of murder, but it was proof of crime. Body trafficking, even of legitimately deceased people, violated Pennsylvania law. It gave Harrison the legal justification he needed to investigate further. In March 1820, Harrison obtained a warrant to search the Garrett funeral home specifically for evidence of body trafficking. The warrant was carefully limited. He couldn't conduct a general search for murder evidence without probable cause. But he could examine the funeral home's records, inspect their preparation areas, and look for evidence of bodies being shipped inappropriately. The search was scheduled for March 15, 1820. But somehow the Garretts learned about it in advance, probably through a corrupt court clerk who'd been paid to provide advance warning of legal proceedings. The Garretts had 3 days to prepare. They spent those 3 days destroying evidence. Ledgers were burned, tools were cleaned or discarded. The basement preparation room was scrubbed thoroughly. Most critically, the bodies stored there, bodies of victims killed over the previous months whose cremation hadn't yet been completed, were hurriedly burned. The furnace ran continuously for 3 days, consuming evidence as quickly as the Garretts could feed it into the flames. When Harrison arrived with his warrant on March 15th, he found a suspiciously clean funeral home. Too clean. The preparation room had been recently scrubbed with lye. The furnace was still warm from recent use. The basement smelled of smoke and something else, something Harrison couldn't quite identify, but that made his stomach turn. But there was no evidence, no bodies, no incriminating records, nothing that proved the Garretts had done anything beyond operating a legitimate funeral business. Harrison was forced to leave empty-handed, knowing he'd been outmaneuvered. The Garretts believed they'd won. They'd avoided prosecution, they'd destroyed the evidence, they'd proven they could survive investigation. That confidence, that sense of invulnerability, led them to make fatal mistakes. They resumed murdering within 2 months of Harrison's search. May 1820, a traveling preacher who'd stopped in Bedford to deliver sermons. June 1820, a young man traveling to Pittsburgh to start a new job. August 1820, an elderly widow traveling to live with her daughter. Each murder followed the same pattern: careful selection, execution, robbery, cremation. Each was documented in a new journal that Margaret had begun keeping, unable to break her compulsive need to record the family's crimes. But they'd become careless in other ways. The preacher's horse was sold locally rather than being shipped elsewhere, and someone recognized it. The young man had written his fiancée about his travel plans, and when he disappeared, she contacted authorities with specific information about his route. The widow's daughter, when her mother didn't arrive, hired a private investigator who proved less constrained by legal niceties than Harrison. Evidence accumulated. Witnesses placed victims at or near the Garrett house before their disappearances. Possessions belonging to missing people began appearing in Bedford shops, sold by people who'd purchased them from the Garretts. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Harrison, still investigating, received a breakthrough in October 1822. A former employee of the funeral home, a young man named Peter Walsh, who'd worked for the Garretts briefly in 1818, came forward with information. Walsh had been fired after expressing discomfort with certain aspects of the business. He'd seen bodies in the basement that weren't accounted for in official records. He'd heard suspicious sounds from the preparation room at night. He'd observed the family destroying clothes and possessions that seemed to have no connection to their legitimate business. Walsh's testimony gave Harrison probable cause for a second, more thorough search. But Harrison waited. He wanted to ensure the Garretts couldn't destroy evidence again. He wanted to catch them with concrete proof of murder, not just suspicious circumstances. He waited over a year, continuing to gather evidence, building relationships with other witnesses, documenting every missing person case connected to Bedford. By late 1823, he had enough. He obtained a new warrant, this one specifically authorizing a search for evidence of murder, and this time, he didn't let the Garretts know in advance. The raid occurred on November 7, 1823, at dawn. Harrison arrived with 6 armed marshals. They surrounded the house to prevent anyone from escaping or destroying evidence. They forced entry simultaneously through front and back doors, and they found the Garrett family at breakfast, completely surprised for the first time in their criminal career. What the marshals discovered over the next 12 hours of searching exceeded Harrison's worst expectations. The basement preparation room contained bodies, not bodies waiting for burial. Bodies of murder victims in various stages of preparation for cremation. Some had been dead for days, preserved with salt and ice. Others were fresher, killed within the past 24 hours. The most recent victims were a married couple, Jonathan and Elizabeth Porter, who'd arrived in Bedford 2 days earlier, traveling to Pittsburgh. The Garretts had offered them lodging. They'd been drugged, robbed, and killed. Their bodies were in the preparation room waiting for cremation. Their possessions were still in the main house, not yet sold or disposed of. The evidence was overwhelming, but the most damning discovery was Margaret's journal, hidden in her bedroom behind a loose board in the wall. The journal documented 9 years of murder. 37 victims were named, though the true number may have been higher. Each entry included the victim's name when known, the date of death, the method used, the items taken, and the disposal method. Margaret had recorded everything with the same meticulous attention to detail other people brought to recipe books or accounting ledgers. The Garrett family was arrested that morning. All 4 members. Silas Garrett, age 58, the patriarch who'd conceived and organized the operation. Constance Garrett, age 54, who'd prepared drugged food and helped dispose of evidence. Thomas Garrett, age 33, the primary killer who'd murdered most of the victims personally, and Margaret Garrett, age 30, who'd kept the records and participated in at least a dozen murders directly. They were separated immediately. Authorities feared they might coordinate stories or attempt suicide if kept together. Each was interrogated individually, and to the investigators' surprise, each confessed relatively quickly. Not from remorse. None of the Garretts expressed genuine remorse, but from a strange pride in their accomplishment. They wanted credit for how successfully they'd operated. They wanted recognition for their criminal efficiency. Silas Garrett explained the business model with the detachment of someone describing a legitimate enterprise. Murder was simply a form of resource acquisition. Bodies were valuable. Personal property was valuable. The morality of taking these things from people who no longer needed them, in his view, was no different from any other form of commerce. Constance Garrett claimed she'd simply followed her husband's lead, that wives were expected to support their husbands' decisions. But her interrogation revealed a woman who'd participated enthusiastically, who'd enjoyed the power that murder provided, who'd suggested several victim selections herself. Thomas Garrett showed the most psychological damage. He'd performed the majority of the actual killings, and the psychological weight had affected him in ways he struggled to articulate. He described feeling detached from his actions, as if he were observing someone else commit the murders. He claimed he felt nothing when he killed, neither pleasure nor guilt, just a kind of empty efficiency. Margaret Garrett's testimony was the most disturbing. She described keeping the journal as a form of artistic expression. Each entry was a story, a narrative of death that satisfied something in her that normal life couldn't provide. She'd never felt guilty about the murders. She'd felt curious, engaged, alive in ways that her ordinary existence as an unmarried woman in a small town never allowed. The trial began in February 1824 in Bedford County Court. It was the most sensational criminal case in Pennsylvania history up to that point. Newspapers across the country covered the proceedings. People traveled from neighboring states to watch the trial. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators eager to see the family of killers. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had the bodies of the Porters and 2 other recent victims. They had Margaret's journal documenting 9 years of murder. They had testimony from former employees, from witnesses who'd seen victims enter the Garrett house and never emerge, from medical professionals who examined the bodies and confirmed they'd died from violence rather than natural causes. The defense attempted to argue temporary insanity for all 4 defendants. They claimed the family had been driven mad by financial stress, that they'd suffered a collective psychological break that made them not responsible for their actions. The argument convinced no one. The Garretts had operated too methodically, too successfully, for too long. This wasn't madness, it was choice. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for all 4 defendants. Murder in the first degree, multiple counts of robbery, desecration of human remains. The evidence admitted no other conclusion. Sentencing occurred 2 days later. Pennsylvania law at the time mandated death by hanging for first-degree murder. Judge William Compson delivered the sentence without hesitation. Silas, Constance, Thomas, and Margaret Garrett would be hanged by the neck until dead. The execution was scheduled for May 12, 1824. The 3 months between sentencing and execution revealed the family's final dynamics. They were housed in separate cells, but allowed brief visits with each other under guard supervision. They spent this time not expressing remorse or seeking religious comfort, but planning how they would be remembered. Silas wrote an autobiography defending his actions, arguing he'd simply been more honest about human nature's predatory aspects than most people dared to be. The document was 40 pages of self-justification without a single acknowledgement that his victims had been human beings with inherent worth. Constance wrote letters to women's publications arguing that wives who supported their husbands' decisions, even criminal decisions, were fulfilling their proper role. Her warped understanding of gender norms made her a subject of morbid fascination for some readers. Thomas refused to write anything, spending his final months in silent contemplation of something he never articulated. Guards reported he seemed almost relieved that his role as the family's executioner would finally end. Margaret continued keeping her journal until the day before her execution. Her final entries described her own approaching death with the same clinical detachment she'd brought to recording her victims' deaths. She expressed curiosity about what dying would feel like. She wondered if she'd finally feel something as the rope tightened around her neck. The execution took place as scheduled on May 12, 1824, in Bedford's public square. Over 2,000 people attended, the largest gathering in the town's history. The Garrett family was brought to the gallows together, all four standing on the same platform. They were asked if they had final words. Silas declined. Constance prayed quietly, though her prayer seemed more concerned with her own fate than her victims. Thomas said nothing. Margaret looked at the crowd and spoke the only words that suggested she'd understood, even briefly, what they'd done. "We took 37 lives," she said, her voice clear in the silent square. "I don't know how to be sorry for that. I don't think I have whatever quality makes people sorry, but I recognize that we shouldn't have done it. That's not the same as being sorry. But it's all I have." The four hoods were placed. The trap door opened. The Garrett family died together as they'd lived together, bound by crimes that had transformed them from ordinary people into something monstrous. The Garrett funeral home was demolished within weeks of the execution. The property was purchased by the county and the building was torn down completely. The bricks were scattered. The wood was burned. Every physical trace of the structure was eliminated. Eventually, a new building was constructed on the site, a church, ironically, as if holy ground might cleanse what had happened there. The bodies discovered in the basement were buried in unmarked graves in Bedford Cemetery. Most couldn't be identified. Families of the missing traveled to Bedford hoping for closure, but decomposition and the Garrett's destruction of personal effects made identification nearly impossible. In 1826, a memorial was erected in the cemetery, a simple stone listing the names of people who disappeared in Bedford County between 1814 and 1826, 1,823. A collective gravestone for victims who'd never been found and others who'd been found but never identified. Margaret's journal was sealed by the court and wasn't released to researchers until 1920, 96 years after the executions. Reading it remains a disturbing experience. The casual tone, the artistic pride she took in documenting murder, the complete absence of empathy for victims who were described as objects, as opportunities, as problems to be solved rather than people to be mourned. Modern criminologists have studied the Garrett case extensively. They represent one of the earliest documented examples of what we now call family-based organized crime, where criminal enterprise is passed down through generations and all family members participate with assigned roles. They also represent an early example of serial murder for profit rather than psychological gratification, though the Garretts clearly derived some form of satisfaction from their crimes beyond just the financial benefit. The psychological question that haunts researchers is how an entire family became murderers. Not one person driven by individual pathology, but four people who collectively decided murder was acceptable and operated together for 9 years. The answer seems to involve a combination of factors. Initial financial desperation that made unethical behavior seem necessary. Gradual escalation from body trafficking to murder that normalized violence. Social isolation that prevented outside perspective from challenging their worldview. And perhaps most importantly, mutual reinforcement where each family member's participation validated the other's choices. The Garrett case influenced American criminal justice in several ways. It prompted Pennsylvania to pass stricter regulations on funeral homes and body preparation. It led to better record-keeping requirements for death certificates and burials. It contributed to reform movements that sought to provide medical schools with legal sources of cadavers, reducing the black market that had enabled the Garretts' initial crimes. And it established legal precedents about family criminal enterprises that would be cited in prosecutions for decades. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Garrett case was the reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself obviously. The Garretts were respectable business people. They attended church. They participated in community life. They provided a legitimate service that families genuinely needed. And behind that facade of normalcy, they murdered 37 people over 9 years without arousing serious suspicion until they became careless. Bedford, Pennsylvania today is a peaceful town of approximately 3,000 residents. Most people who live there don't know about the Garrett family. The church built on the funeral home site has no plaque or marker acknowledging what stood there before. The graves of the unidentified victims remain unmarked in the cemetery. The history has been deliberately forgotten, buried as completely as the bodies the Garretts tried to hide. But some memories persist. Local historians keep the story alive. Descendants of families who lost loved ones to the Garretts still gather occasionally at the memorial stone. And researchers continue studying Margaret's journal, trying to understand how four ordinary people became monsters, how a family that should have been bound by love instead became bound by murder. What do you think about the Garrett family? How could an entire family participate in systematic murder without anyone breaking? Leave your comment below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who appreciates dark history told honestly. The stories we're most tempted to forget are often the ones most important to remember. At Liturgy of Fear, we believe in facing history's darkest chapters without flinching, because understanding how evil operates is the first step toward preventing it from happening again.